another Industry Expert Series webinar hosted by OrthoFi. I'm your host, Marla Merritt, and tonight's guest is Ryan Moynihan from Gaidge, who will be teaching us how to revolutionize orthodontic profitability and efficiency with his digital transformation blueprint. For those of you who are joining one of our webinars for the first time, the format is that we bring in some of the industry's most trusted experts, and we just spend an hour learning from them. Earlier this year, OrthoFi hosted an orthodontic business meeting in Denver. We call that meeting Nexus, and if you've never joined us before, you don't want to miss another one. So join us next year. The theme for the 2024 meeting in Colorado was Get Uncomfortable. And during that meeting, we had some of the industry's best speakers talking about topics like boosting revenue without increasing starts, boosting adult starts through limited treatment, and also greater aligner share chair and the orthodontic office of the future. So lots of great topics at our meeting last year. And it was so stellar, the content that we were able to present at that meeting. And we just decided to bring many of the sessions to the industry by way of this webinar series. So be sure to join us throughout the year to learn from the industry's best and brightest. Now, throughout this webinar, you will be able to submit your questions using the Q&A button. So not the chat, make sure you're using the Q&A. And we'll try to leave time to answer those questions live at the end of the webinar. If we run out of time, we will forward your questions to the speaker and try to get those answers submitted to you individually. But usually we do have some time for the questions. So just make sure you're adding them throughout the session. So if Ryan says something that you're like, hey, I want to know a little bit more about that, just put the question in the Q&A. We're going to field those, kind of group them by topic, and then we'll ask Ryan at the end of the webinar to provide us with some answers. So now let's get on to the good stuff. Ryan Moynihan joined Gaidge as their CEO in 2017. He has quite a diverse background in finance, analytics, strategy, sales, marketing, business development, and product management, and then also operations. So that made him just the perfect person for the role at Gaidge. Ron's career actually spans over 20 plus years and across many Fortune 100 companies in healthcare, consulting, and technology. So pretty cool fact, he worked at Disney, Intel, Ernst & Young, and also Miller Brewing Company before he earned his MBA from Georgetown. Ron has spent the past 17 years of his career in the dental industry, working for 3M and Ormco in marketing and sales leadership positions before joining Gaidge. So as I mentioned, Ryan is giving us a similar but updated version of his Nexus presentation tonight. At Nexus, we were encouraging practices to get uncomfortable. And so I asked Ryan to tell me about a time he got uncomfortable by taking a chance, a risk. And he told me about a time that he got uncomfortable by, he was accepted into the MBA program at Georgetown when he was 28, but he'd also been accepted to a program at Boston College. So accepting with Georgetown would mean Ryan would have to leave the workforce and fund the program personally. But if he went to Boston, it would mean he could continue working at Intel with a full scholarship. So Ryan did ultimately choose Georgetown, which ended up taking him on just an amazing journey, both personally and professionally. It was a very uncomfortable decision, but now he can't imagine having taken a different path. And that's really what our hope is throughout these various webinars, is to really take you on a journey and just give you some encouragement to get a little uncomfortable and try something new in your practice that is proving successful in other practices. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us, and we really just can't wait to learn from you tonight.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Marla. Appreciate it, OrthoFi. I had forgotten that I had submitted that since it's been since January, so that was kind of,
it was an awesome story. I love it.
Fun to hear that. Yeah, definitely was not I was definitely not wanting to take the risk back as a 28-year-old. So, but like I said, life paths would have been totally different. And I feel I've been so blessed to be part of the ortho industry for the last 10 plus years. So here we are. So I think it all works itself out. So, which is great. Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right, so thanks everyone for joining tonight. When we booked this date, I didn't realize that it's the Sweet 16 tonight for the NCAA tournament. So I'm sure many of you probably have one eye on that if you are a basketball fan, and then maybe one eye on this as well. So unfortunately, the brackets seem to be pretty chalk and versus a lot of upsets, as we got to the Sweet 16, but still a lot of good teams playing each other. So it should be fun to watch this weekend. So today, if you were at the meeting or if you weren't at the meeting, I just want to walk through for the next 35, 40 minutes on just kind of, we look at revolutionizing the orthodontic profitability and efficiency and looking at, as we go digital, how's that going to transform your practice and what does that look like from a statistics and a numbers and a profitability standpoint. So today's roadmap, I will draw upon, and it just dawned on me this year, actually, one of these industry evolutions that I experienced through Intel and how it pertains to orthodontics. Walk through kind of how we get the data for what we're going to look at tonight. We'll look back a little bit at 2023 and what the market did. And then the meat and the potatoes of this is getting into the stats that drive profitability, and then ultimately ending on the digital transformation blueprint and what that looks like. So Marla mentioned I do have some experience working at Intel in a former life, actually my first job out of undergrad. And, if we think about, as you start to transition to digital in your practice, you're gonna have more efficiency, and efficiency does drive profitability. And so Intel had a similar challenge back in the day. So any of you followed the stock in the 90s, I think it went up 78 times over a course of 10 years. So a lot of people made a lot of money investing in that stock back in the day. But bottom line, when I started there, they make computer chips, and those are made on a wafer, circular wafer there. So if we go back to our geometry days of pi r squared, they had fabrication plants around the world. I think they had 14 or 15 of them, and they all manufactured on a 6-inch wafer. Ultimately, they created technology to move up to an 8-inch wafer. So if you think about it just from a capacity standpoint, you go from 28 square inches to 50 square inches. So you can fit a lot more microprocessors, semiconductors on those wafers versus a 6-inch. And then by the time I had left, they had started to open up their 12-inch facilities. And so when you look at that and you look at capacity going from 28 square inches to 113 square inches, you don't need as many factories. And so there's a lot of overhead obviously associated with that. Similarly with orthodontics, right? The more efficiently you can treat a patient, the less appointments, the more capacity you have in your practice, whether it's you work less or you fill that capacity up with more patients, your choice. We'll walk through that later today. So, just improving there was 79% and then 126. And if you look at from the beginning to the end, it's about a 304% increase in capacity. So definitely saw a lot of efficiencies. It took a lot of cost out of their operation. And ultimately, as the computer market grew in the late 90s, early 2000s, that company had a great run of success in the marketplace. So just we'll start to parallel that as we go through the evening. If we look at just practices then, versus now. Then I'm kind of looking at 2015 to 2020 pre-pandemic. 1 to 200 practices, 1.5 locations, smaller staffs. Treatment efficiency wasn't really a big focus at that point. So 26 to 30 months was the average treatment time. A lot of office visits, 22. Staff is very loyal, 8 to 20 years, working 16 to 18 days a month. And then revenue wise, you're about 1.2 to 2.5, and then about 50% overhead. You transpose that to kind of what we see today, similar, yes, 1 to 200 practices. We do have obviously more OSOs, group practices that are out there, but on average, the single to multi-owner practice is now at 2.5 locations. Staff has grown, almost doubled over the previous period, and then treatment efficiency is important now. We're really trying to get fewer and fewer visits and fewer months in treatment, so we're seeing that cascade down. Staff is also not as loyal. So 3 to 5 years is the average duration of a staff. And then we're working less, 12 to 14 days, we're making more. And our overhead's gone up a little bit. Obviously, that's a function of staff. So just kind of looking at, how orthodontics has transformed from then to now, just to kind of set the stage. So when we look at the data source for what we're going to talk about tonight, it does come out of Gaidge. And so if we're looking at Gaidge, Gaidge is a data analytics system that plugs into the big 5 practice management systems within orthodontics. So it's not self-reported data. It's actually system of record data that comes directly out of your practice management system within your practice. And what Gaidge does on a nightly basis is it pulls the over 80 different key performance indicators and visualizes them for the orthodontist to be able to, for he or she to be able to figure out exactly where they're winning or losing and how their practice is doing on a daily basis. And so we look at 80 metrics that are there. Obviously not going to look at all of them, but some people are interested in some and not others. And so we kind of have a variety there for everybody. It cascades into 35 different practice reports across 9 dashboards. Have also the ability to budget and look at comparisons. And so we do have industry benchmarks as well that you can compare yourself with. And then ultimately you can also hook it up to your PMS, probably your accounting software as well. So gives you the ability to dive a little deeper. And when you can combine that operational data with your account expense level data, there's some really cool trends. And a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight with the presentation is going to be garnered around combining those two data sources to really show what drives profitability. So just a little bit about, kind of setting the stage for where a lot of the data you're going to see in aggregate tonight, where it comes from and kind of the source of it. These are the integration partners that Gaidge does have. So like I said, the big 5 plus OrthoFi as well. So it's a pretty good picture of what's going on in the orthodontic market in the US. All right, so let's take a quick look back at 2023. We've come out of COVID. We had a great year. 21 into early 22, and then the back half of 22 things started to kind of go down a little bit. 23 was 22 ended up being a tough year. 23's kind of a down to slightly flat to down year. If we look at net production, slightly down. Net collection is down about 1.5 points, and then we look at this net production to net collection ratio. We want that to be about 5 to 20%. So we want our net production to exceed our collection by about 5 to 20%. When you're not growing year over year collectively, that ratio is not going to happen. And so we did see about 2.7% last year, where we'd like it a little bit higher than that. As we look at average contract amount, we do have, we're obviously in a big inflationary period. And so we did see that rise about 2.1%. I'd like to see it a little bit more. Obviously, inflation is a little bit more than 2% out there. And I think orthodontists have the opportunity to take some price with their fees. And then contract average down payment was down 2.2% last year. If we look at our funnel, our patient funnel, exams and starts, we added about 1,000 new patients. So it's down a little bit year over year. And then we had 879 new patient exams, also down about 2 points. I like to look at this new patient to exam ratio. We want that to be around 90%. Last year, we saw it around 81.2%. And so that's a little bit lower than where I'd like to see it. So if you think about, you lost almost 19% of the patients that called you and gave you their information and, ultimately intended to come see your practice. So just a little bit lower than where we thought it would be. Then we saw the child exams and adult exams. It's about a 2/3, 1/3 split there. And then our total number of new patient starts was around 641. That was down almost 4 points. And then we look at this kind of the Pareto of where we get our starts. Aligner treatment is around 27%. We call that share of chair. And then you can kind of see the rest of the mix there, with full treatment about half of it. And then you've got phase 1 and phase 2 that are making up the balance of everything else. Same day starts for about 19%. And then average number of future exams, that's 64, and that's down about 4.4. Now that's just a point in time. That's what happened in December. But there's also a really good indicator of kind of what's that funnel ahead of next month you're looking at, and kind of how robust is that for potential patients that are coming in for exams. Finally, we have treatment efficiency, and treatment efficiency is defined as what are you charging for treatment divided by how many months it takes you to complete treatment. And so just across the spectrum here, from full phase 1, phase 2 to aligner, you can kind of see the different amounts there. We like to see that above 310. And when we get into showing kind of how that drives profitability, that'll come more into light for all of us. Now, a couple things here last year that we noticed that, a lot of the reason for this digital transformation and treatment efficiency is that we saw value per visit go down about a percentage on average for the first time since I've been tracking the data for the last 7 years. We saw full treatment visits increase and months in treatment increase slightly. And then aligners actually increased pretty substantially. Visits were up 8% and months in treatment were up 7.2%. Now, there's probably more difficult cases that are being done with aligners these days, so that could be definitely driving it. But I think it's really important as we get into this profitability conversation, that understanding our treatment efficiency, our value per visit is going to be a big piece of how we move this thing forward and do it efficiently and profitably as we move forward. I love to compare to the OSOs out there just to give everybody a comparison. So everything we just looked at on the previous slides is kind of put into a chart format here. And, within the Gaidge system, we probably have around 20 to 25 of these OSOs. So it's the aggregate of those practices, those group practices here. So on average, I think the OSOs did better than the single and multi-doctor practices, from a production collection. So they actually did see growth versus a little bit of retraction in the US market. They're not charging as much, so I think there's an opportunity for higher contract fees and initial payments. So I think the single and multi-doctor are doing really well as far as charging for fees and services compared to what the OSOs are doing. They did have a stronger front end of the patient funnel, so new patient exams actually showed growth versus retraction on the USA side. And then when it comes to just overall total patient starts, as we peel away aligners and all other starts, they did see growth there. Versus US did not. And aligners, as you can see there, were just basically flat. And, the double-digit decline in aligners over the last couple of years, continued for the non-group practices. And they did see growth in child aligners and all other starts. And then there's a shared share opportunity, so they don't do as many, they're not doing as much digital and aligners within the OSO practices. So just another way to kind of carve up the data and share it out. We like to look at when we look at just the economy and what's going on. Obviously, there are leading indicators, and those leading indicators are shown here on this chart. And then there are business cycles, and there's 4 different distinct business cycles, from recovery, accelerating growth, to slowing growth, to recession. And I love this chart. We use ITR Economics as a partner to get this data. And the good news is that last year, when we started this conversation, the same time this time last year, I would say housing and financial were in the red. They were in recession. Wholesale trade has just moved from the yellow to the red. But all of those other yellow leading indicators have been yellow for the better part of the last year. So question will be do they experience a soft landing, or do they kind of go into that recessionary period and then start to recover? What's good news is that housing and financial, like I mentioned last year, they were in the red. They've started to move their way out. Financial actually being in an accelerating growth area, and housing in a recovery space. So I think probably of the leading indicators there, those are 2 of the more important ones, and we're seeing those on the mend and on the way up. So that's really encouraging to see. We like to look at this rates of change model for the orthodontic space. And so what we're looking at here, as this graph unfolds itself, is we're comparing a 3-month rolling average for net production in aggregate for the USA practices to a 12-month rolling net production average. And we're looking at this over a span of about 5 years. And what's really interesting about the orthodontic industry, and I love this chart as a function of just there's business cycles that are out there, and we all need to kind of work through those. But over time, what is it telling us about the health of our industry? And so if we go back pre-COVID, here you can see between the green lines that the industry does not gyrate all that much. It has a pretty tight oscillation between 0 and 5%, maybe leading up to COVID. It jumped up a little bit above that, which is good. We did have the period for COVID, the shutdown, and I did normalize that. So we didn't, kind of take the industry to 0 or negative 90%. Because we were shut down. So I normalized that with the prior year results, but that was only a short period of time. And then as you come out of COVID, you can see these spikes where the blue line really spikes up there, and it's growth that the orthodontic industry has not seen for a long time. So 2025 approaching 30% growth. It was sustained for a good 12, 18 months, which is really cool to see. And then that growth, and a lot of it was driven by adults. You all heard about the Zoom effect. We saw adult starts go from 6% growth to 24% growth. So they really made a big impact in this blue line. We've seen that fall off now as we've moved into 23 and 24. But as that blue line started to retract and go below the orange line, you want the blue line to be above the orange line. That's a sign of growth. And you can see over the last couple of years, it's kind of cascaded a little bit down towards 0. where it's landed, at the end of 2023. So last year we saw the results there kind of flat to a little bit down. If we add in net production, just to kind of look at those bars as we go across. And then this is actually up-to-date data as of yesterday. So within the Gaidge system, we can get data daily. So this is March 2024 year to date. So we're looking at, kind of a flat industry, still a little bit down. We had a flat January. We had a really good February, and it's probably because of leap year. We had that extra day. And then March has given back a little bit, but overall flat. I think what we're going to see this year is probably a little rinse and repeat from last year. So we're pacing that through the first 3 months of the year pretty well. But the big takeaway here is that if we look at this industry over time, it's very healthy, 4.6% compounded annual growth rate. So that's something that, I think as we have these business cycles, we go up, we go down. It's really important to just look at it over time, because you are going to have the ups and downs, and over time, it's a very, very healthy industry. So it's almost like stay the course. We'll get through this. And I know probably 24 is going to look similar to 23, but I think we're going to see some growth years in 25 and 26 as the economists predict that. So just a little bit more, just different way to carve up the industry there. We also look at this as we compare this to some of the leading indicators. It's kind of fun. I've overlaid the orthodontic production with a handful of the indicators, and they seems to parallel single housing starts pretty well. So if we go back 2 slides, we saw housing's on the rise. Orthodontics parallels it pretty good, so it'll probably mimic that as we move forward. All right, so that's a little bit. I apologize for my voice. That's a little bit of just an overview of what the market has done over the past year and kind of the space that we're playing in. And now let's look at the statistics that drive profitability. And what we've been able to do, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the call, is we've matched or meshed the operational data in Gaidge that comes out of the practice management system with the accounting data that comes out of your QuickBooks accounts. And we have about 450 counts that we've been able to run this analysis for. And what we did is we did a multilinear regression analysis where we've identified a handful of variables that we think help drive profitability. And that's anything from your different spending categories to treatment efficiency, to headcount, to value per visit, those types of things. And we've kind of put them all into a regression model, looked at how they correlate with each other. And then, you run and iterate the statistical model. And then at the end of the day, when you get to a certain predictor, it says, okay, these are the variables that absolutely say, these are the variables that predict what's going to happen or what's going to drive profit per clinical day. And the way we're looking at it is we're trying to distill this down to every single day I go to work, what is the profit that I'm able to generate in my practice? And so that's why we're using this profit per owner day or profit per clinical day, profit per day that the doctor worked. And so the data will tell us to manage these 3 critical metrics. And these might seem pretty obvious, but we're going to peel each one back, and we're going to look at just some different tactics and opportunities to, do maybe a little bit better job of driving each one of these. And, the first one is starts per day. So when we think about driving profit per day, starts per day come number 1 out of the model. And that's, you want to get close to 3.5 starts per day. So if you're thinking about your practice is every single day I go to work, am I at that Mendoza line of 3 to 3.5? And if I am, then I'm going to be able to drive that profitability. Value per visit, we talked earlier about that. We want that above $310, and then expenses, try to get that below 60% of your net collections. And so the first one is we'll look at starts per clinical day. And the way that we did this is that we said, okay, what is one additional start per week, or 0.25 starts a day if we're working 4 days a week? What does that drive to profit per day? What's that impact? So we're distilling this down to the these bite-sized pieces. Is for every additional start per week, what is that driving for my profitability in my practice? So if we look at just how do we drive starts per day? We've got a big market out there, right? You want to start big, and then you want to hone into the specific systems or processes that you can do. So if we look at the population, we're out chasing, there's 331 people in North America, or in the US, I'm sorry, of which if we were to diagnose and look at their teeth, it's about 100 million. And at any one time, 4 to 5 million are actually in treatment with an orthodontist. So we kind of asked, where are the other 95 million? Are they unaware, don't care, can't afford? Maybe you don't believe 100 million, but maybe you believe 50 million, maybe you believe 20 million. Regardless, if we could actually move the needle from 4 to 5 to 5 to 6, we would go back to that chart that I showed you where we had the 25, 30% growth. It would totally turn this industry on its head. So there's a good population out there. And I think over time, you're going to continue to see that there's a population for orthodontists. So it should be a healthy industry going forward. When we look at just the patient journey, it's changed a lot. So this is kind of your old school, original awareness, consideration, purchase, retention, advocacy. Obviously, those things still exist, but with social media and digitization, there's a lot more interaction points, a lot more touch points that allow the patient to engage with your practice, get them in, create that relationship, start treatment, and then ultimately be treated with clinical excellence and efficiency. So it's really important, as you do market your practice, that a lot of these different digital opportunities are taken into account for your practice. With marketing, I always encourage everybody that I think it's necessary. You've got to spend it, but do you also, especially with digital tools that are out there now, there's a great way to have ROI to your marketing spend. And so, when I look at putting a little quad box over this, if you're in that lower section, you're not spending all that much, but you're getting, some decent return from patient exams, you probably should invest. Here, you're not spending that much, but you're getting a lot of return. You're above the line there. You're efficient. Over here, you should analyze because you're spending, but you're also getting. And then if you're down here, you're ineffective. So that's just kind of a way to think about it. But the big takeaway here is to understand your marketing ROI, depending upon how you choose to invest those dollars. This is one of my favorite slides because this is your new patient journey. This walks you through, how do you get a patient from calling you into your practice, and what's the potential leaky bucket along the way that you might be missing as a function of, just not having good processes or systems in place here. And so a single doctor practice has about 835 new patient calls, of which over a course of a year, 676 will come in for an exam. And then 264 will start right away from that exam. And then obviously you're continually working those exams to try to get them into a start. And so there is an observation group that most practices have. So 94 came out of observation. So you've got your 264 plus your 94 that came out. And then of those 676 that, didn't start right away, 79 ended up starting for a total of 437. So when you look at this, you had 835 calls, but you only had 437 people start. Is that a healthy funnel? I would say no. This is a USA aggregate average. I believe there's a lot of opportunity in orthodontic offices to improve this. And so, whether you're using a tool like Gaidge or you're using your own practice management or a spreadsheet or however you are, I really encourage all of you to, first understand what is your new patient call to exam target. Here, if you were at 90%, you would have 752 exams. And as you cascade that through based on case acceptance, that would give you about $215,000 of additional opportunity. Observation, you should have about 25% of starts. That would give you 109, which would be about $75,000. And then your exam to start target is about 70%. So that, bring your total starts up to about 473. So all in all, like I said, depending upon how you track it, it's really good to know this equation, so to speak, or these numbers for your practice, because there could be a lot of dollars that you're missing out on as a function of just patients slipping through the cracks. When we go drill into observation, within the Gaidge system, you do have the ability to see your observation patients by age. And so that categorizes them by age. So if we look at, on average, as we ended last year, there were 433 patients in observation, of which 57% were 11 years or older. So I would assume that that's close to, if not at, orthodontic age. You want to probably try to pull them into your practice and get them started. Then we should see those patients, 10% at least every month. We only saw 7% of them, and then 30% of them weren't even seen in the last 12 months. So it just shows that, with data, with analytics, there's an opportunity there to, really, shore up your systems and your processes. And so if you're not seeing a 30-year observation patients in a year and 57% are 11 years or older, there's probably some easy starts that are residing in your observation pool that you should take a look at. So when we put math to this through the model, if we had that one additional start per week, we think that's worth about $377 of profit. And if you're a single doctor practice and you aggregate that up for 14 days a month and 168 days a year, That's about $63,000 of additional profitability. So maybe you're doing 2 a week, you just double the number. But it just kind of gives you a way to say, hey, that one additional start's worth about $64,000 in a practice. So give or take. And obviously there's ranges there depending upon your practice size, but we'll stick in the middle here for this one. Next up is value per visit. We try to get to 310. And so what we're going to look at here is if I could just increase this by $1, what would that do to my practice? And so when we look at value per visit, and we talked about this earlier, it's what you're charging for treatment divided by how many visits it takes for you to complete treatment. On the left, we have brackets. On the right, we have aligners. And then we've bucketed each of the chart here on the left and the right, it's bucketed based on number of visits. Okay. So, the more efficient you are on the left-hand side of each section, you're going to have a higher value per visit, 11 to 14 starts, for aligners, 5 to 9. And then as you can see, as you get higher up in the number of, not starts, but visits, you're going to start to see a reduction in your value per visit. And so, it's really important to understand this, to know this, and make sure that you have a good protocol for treating patients that, hopefully you're not in the 25 to 30 visits or 19 to 25 if you're doing aligners, because that will cost you profitability within your practice. And so as we look at value per visit, there is a thing called estimated completion date as well. So all orthodontists, when you diagnose treatment, you say, hey, I think I can finish in 22 months. And the clock starts when you bond them up. And then, at 23, 24, 25 months, you're over estimated completion date. So that's also tracked within Gaidge. What's interesting here is that 57% of patients are well over ECD. And that's probably an opportunity for improvement because you're continuing to add appointments to those patients. And, that's costing you profitability in your practice. And then if you look at margin per visit, along with value per visit, if you are a middle 20% aligner producer when it comes to treatment efficiency, it's still considered more profitable than a top 20% bracket producer as a function of margin per visit for that. So just something to keep in mind there, that from a profit standpoint, you are going to drive more a profit and efficiency by being more efficient on your treatment times. So with value per visit, it's not necessarily you have to go do a bunch of aligners. You got to choose a treatment modality that suits your ability to see patients less frequently. What's your early indicator process to identify patients not tracking the estimated completion date? And then how do you optimize treatment and address those estimated completion date challenges? And so when we put math to this, $1 is worth $4.65 in value per visit, and that will annualize into $781. Now that may not seem like a big number, but I promise you, once you start getting more and more efficient on the treatment side, those numbers are going to go up by 10, 20, 50, 100. And so when you start multiplying the 781 by those numbers, it becomes very material for our practice. And then finally, we're going to talk about expenses. That's the third element of what drives profit per day. And so when we look at expenses, we're going to look at what is 1% change against net collections. What does that do to profitability in the practice? And so when you look at your expense Pareto in a practice, and this is call it the 6 big buckets that an orthodontic practice has. It's your staff costs, it's marketing, it's aligners, it's clinical and lab, it's equipment and facility. And then there's obviously an other bucket that usually falls there with more ancillary spend there. Each one of these dots represents a practice, and the practice is what percent to collections are they, is there, let's just take staff, for example. The boxes that are colored, that's 50% of the data. And then the little T's on top and bottom, that's 95% of the data. But if we're looking at, some of those dots that are outside of the blue boxes, those are costing you profitability. And so for every percentage of that's increased above the box, that's costing you a percent of profitability on the bottom line. So I think the big question for all of you is, do you know what your practice's spending percentages are across these Pareto categories? It's really important to know that. If we look at the big categories, this is kind of where you should be. Staff's around 24. That's actually gone up over the last couple of years because of inflation, and wages have increased. Clinical supply and lab is 15, marketing is about 5, equipment and facilities 10, and then the rest of it, the other category is about 6. And so if you look at that, that'll kind of give you a good picture of where you're at. So my biggest thing is you got to regularly monitor those expenses. So I know a lot of orthodontists I've talked to maybe look at this once, twice a year. I think it's important to look at it monthly. Running a business, it's important to know your expenses there. And just kind of, if this is new to you, just start to dive in on the highest percent areas. You're not going to boil the ocean and figure it all out, but pick one or two and just kind of see where you're at on that. So that'd be my advice. And then if you put math to this, there is a range in this one because we do have 6 spending Pareto categories. So that 1% increase against net collections is likely to net you anywhere from 170 to 415 in profitability. So that'll range from $28,000 to $70,000. So a big piece there. So if we put this all together, these are the 3 critical metrics that we need to be aware of. Starts per day, value per visit, and managing expenses. And I would say starts per day, I have those numbers on the left-hand side, is probably your most impactful driver. So 50% is what you're going to see there. And then the other 2 are probably split 25-25. And so, there's a couple takeaway notes here that you're able to have as far as, some of the things that we just talked about and what that means to your practice. And so as we wrap up, we're going to kind of transition now into, the digital transformation blueprint and what you can do in order to, drive this treatment efficiency in your practice. So we talked about starts per day. And so these are the practices clustered based on their profitability per day and their starts per day. And so on average, we've got about 3.1 is the median starts per day. And so on the right-hand side over there, you can kind of see what we just talked through. If you're able to get a half a start a day or 0.25 starts a day or a half a start a day, what we'll do from an impact standpoint. So if we go back to our geometry days and we look at that fun equation, y equals mx plus b, based on this curve here, or that line, this is what it calculates to be, is that your starts per clinical day. So for your practice, if you're in this pool of doctors or practices that I just showed, let's just say your starts per clinical day was 3. You would multiply that by 2985. You would subtract 2046, and that would be your expected profit per clinical day. Then you'd actually calculate your actual profit per day, and that would be exactly kind of what are you currently doing. This would be what you expect versus what you're actually doing. And then, depending upon where you end up there, if actual profit per day is less than expected, you'd want to evaluate treatment efficiency and key expense percentages for right sizing. And then you just want to determine your opportunity on starts per day. And so if it's less than 3, what is required to improve that by 1 a week? So if we go back to our chart here, and we've got, over here, if I'm higher than 3.1, but I'm below the regression line, I would want to evaluate my efficiency and expenses and see if there's an opportunity there. If I'm less than, and I'm also lower than line, I need to evaluate efficiency and invest because I'm not doing as much as I can. If I'm here, I'm actually above the line. I'm not getting many starts per day, but I'm really profitable with what I'm getting. So I would want to invest because I could probably move up the line, up the curve. And then if I'm up here, this is where you celebrate, right? You've got high starts per day, high profitability, and that's exactly the quadrant you want to be in. So if you start to think about your practice in that standpoint, kind of where are you on this regression line? And like I said, this is the pool of folks that we have that subscribe to both Gaidge and our executive program. And we're able to, kind of run this analysis behind the scenes and do this based on the aggregate for the orthodontic industry. So you want to be kind of above 3.1 and roughly somewhere around, call it, $7,000, $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 up to $15,000 of profit per day is kind of where that calculates out. If we look at treatment visits are up, impacting value per visit. So I mentioned earlier in the call, we're seeing more visits for brackets and for aligners, and also the time in treatment, other than for child is down a little bit, but adult is up, and aligners is up big time, 6.3 and 7.4 for both visits and months. So, obviously aligners still take less than 3 months and 5 to 6 less visits, even for teenagers. So, there is some benefit here to efficiency. And now, if we kind of put this together, I call this the big 3 scorecard. And what this is, it looks at, profit per clinical day. It looks at your starts per day. and it looks at your value per visit blend, and then your total expense of net collections, and it kind of then forecasts, what do you need to work on? And so if you're green across the top, starts and expenses there with the 1.3. If, down at the bottom, got 3.3 starts per day, 473.42, that's the Mai Tai, that's the Go Celebrate. So it's just it's a analytical way to look at your data across a handful of spectrums and then be able to understand exactly where you need to go from a practice standpoint. So as we get into digital practice transformation impacts, why would you go digital? We're going to look at a case study. We're going to take some USA aggregate averages. We're going to look at, assume, some aligner share of chair scenarios. What does that do to your schedule and capacity? And then what could that do to drive production and profitability? And then ultimately, how would you shift your expenses and then look at overall practice growth? And so when we look at digital transformation impacts, it's about capacity, expenses, and growth. So why would you increase your digital footprint? Maybe I want to work fewer days. Maybe I open up more availability for exams. I become more efficient. I increase profitability. And then I increase production with current schedule and opportunity for same-day start. So kind of doing more with less. And your practice culture potentially could improve as well. What impacts your efficiency, your team, processes, days work, using technology, bracket choice, and aligner mix, and that all factors into the equation for how you would look at efficiency. And then you ultimately got to understand your schedule capacity. And so, how many days are you going to work? Okay, that's kind of your limiter. How many hours per day are you going to work? How many chairs do you have in your practice? What's your average appointment time? And then that will ultimately get you your appointments per hour, per day, per month, and it'll give you a capacity number. So those are just ways that we're going to show you here in a model that we broke it down, just assuming that. So as we look at this case study, we're looking at USA aggregate scenarios, and we're going to go to the extreme of I'm all brackets to I'm all aligners. Obviously, there's probably not a lot of practices that fall in those categories, but we do measure value per visit based on all the brackets systems that you do in your practice and all the aligner cases that you do in your practice. So we're going to start with that as the baseline. And then as we move up the share of chair continuum, we'll do a weighted average based on that and come up with, what those value per visits look like from that standpoint. So if you were to do 20% aligners, and also this also factors into digital, right? So if you're using a digital bracket system, it's very much the same. It's just about fewer treatment. Right. So our fewer visits, our visits are 13 for all aligners, or you could also think of that as all digital. And as you go to 30, you can just start to see now the total visits and the value per visit increases here. And we try to chart that out. The higher up you are with your share of chair on digital or aligners, the higher your value per visit goes. And we know value per visit does have a direct impact on profitability. So in the model that we created, these are assumptions, right? Your practice is probably going to be different, but we said, hey, we're working 14 days a month, 7 hours a day, and we have 5 chairs. Our bracket appointment time is 30 minutes. So that gives us 2 visits per hour, 70 a day, and 980 a month. And then our aligner appointment time is 20 minutes, and that gives us 3 an hour, 105, and then 1470 over the course of a month. And so as we kind of look at schedule, will be the first thing we look at. And we're going to look at, how many appointments did you save, hours did you save, clinical days did you save per month and per year? And then how did that help improve your capacity? So as we open this up, you can see as you move up the continuum, and where we're really looking at here is capacity. Capacity is improving. Number of appointments saved, hours, clinic days saved. That's all improving. And then the question will be, what do you do with that? Do you fill that capacity up because now you have it? Or is that something where you work less? If you're saving 1.1 days a month, maybe you have 1 less day a month that you work, get another day off, travel a little bit, it's up to you what you want to do with it, but you'll get the same output that way, and you'll probably be able to save a little bit of profitability that way. When we look at production and profit, leveraging the same model, now we're going to look at, let's just imagine we do fill that capacity up. So what can we do to increase capacity per day, per month, per year? And basically here, as you start, most practices are right around that 28% share of chair. So I like that 30 to 50 or 50 to 65 and 65 to 80 if you're in that camp. But, you could improve your production per year by about $70,000 going from 30 to 50.
And then another 45 if you go from 50 to 65. So, all up, if you look at both of those, it could be somewhere around, 100 and 115, 116,000, something like that. If you look at share capacity, production as well, when you look at profit, so now we're looking at the profit line, you could increase that, kind of as we move from 30 to 50, about 30 grand, and then another 21 for that next jump, and another 21 from that next jump. So there's definitely some big opportunities there as you get more efficient with treatment. When it comes to expense management and how that shifts, what we have here is we've got a couple different scenarios. I'll just kind of build these out, and we're looking at, basically what we looked at earlier, just what is the makeup of these different practices at these different levels. And this is more projected. I would say this is not coming straight out of the Gaidge system, because we're not necessarily seeing the treatment we're not seeing the expense efficiencies yet play out based on the treatment efficiency. We just know that there should be some inherent savings as a function of being able to be more efficient there. And so as you look at profitability, you kind of stay at that flat 40% range up through 30, and then you start to see some increases there as you get to 50, 65, and 80. And it's not drastic, but I mean, a point or two, especially when your practice has $1 million, $2 million, $3 million, $4 million of net production on top, can be pretty material in your overall profitability line. So just to be thinking about that, and as you start to scale this, how are you shaping out your expense Pareto for your business? And then, so as we kind of wrap this one up and put it all together, what's interesting through the Gaidge system, based on practices that are at these different levels, we do see growth. We do see practices that are a little bit bigger as you move from kind of all brackets into, more digital. So I will say that, we're seeing about a little bit about $100,000 more. We're seeing 3.3 starts a day. We're seeing more growth as we move up this continuum as well. So on the lower end, we're seeing practices that aren't necessarily growing. So your profit, and we're comparing everything to assuming you were all brackets. So in this scenario, if you went from all brackets 20%, obviously practices are somewhere in between there, you'd have a profit growth of about 4.5%. If we go to 30%, so moving from 20 to 30, you jump to 8.1. So that incremental from 4.5 to 8.1 is another 4 points. And then as you go to 50, you double, you go up 8 points there. What we're also seeing, if you notice that the growth of these practices last year, you start to see growth the more digital you are out there. And then when you get to 65 and 80, we just see a bigger growth trend out there. Profitability, obviously, too, as you compare that back to brackets, becomes a lot more substantial as well. So just moving up that continuum allows that to happen. So ultimately, you get this opportunity for growth and profitability by realizing these efficiencies of digital, practice size, practice growth, and expense efficiency. So just to wrap up here, I know we're kind of running out of time. If we do increase aligner share, and I also want to make sure that's digital as well, you do see your value per visit improvements. It does open up your practice schedule. What are you going to do with that? It leads to opportunities to drive an improved expense Pareto. And then it increases the overall practice growth and profitability, and the trifecta of size growth and spend ultimately gets you to where you need to be. So with that, I know I went through a lot of data quickly. If you do want a copy of this, please take the QR code there, and I'll make sure that I think you just have to fill out your name and email, and then we'll send you a copy of this that you can get. And that way, hopefully, maybe you take a little bit more time to digest it. I know it was a lot of material to go through in a short amount of time there. So we'll keep that up for a minute if everyone's interested in that. And then I think, Marla, if you want to do Q&A, we can go to that.
Sure. Thank you so much, Ryan. That was fantastic. And you're right, that is a lot of data.
It's a lot, yeah, I know.
So for those data people on the call, I know this was like you were soaking it all in. So super great information. So a few questions. So we did have a question about the starts per day chart, and this was a little bit earlier on in the webinar. Wondering if that is based on one doctor.
Oh, no, that's our aggregate pool. That's 450 doctors. Or what are you saying? One doctor practice
For
or?
one doctor practice?
Yeah,
Yes.
it's a combination of it's a combination of all of our practices. So it's single and multi. It does not include groups. So it would be probably the range would be 1 to 3 doctors and up to maybe 5 locations would be the majority of it. So, but it's a mix across there.
Yeah. So the aggregate of that.
It's
Okay.
aggregate, yeah. So it's not just a single doctor analysis. I don't know if we have the statistical significance to do the single doctor then versus a multi-doctor, or I'm sure we do in 450, but we haven't done that yet. We wanted to put as much data into the model to see what we could get out of it.
Right. Okay. So when calculating VPV, that's values per visit, correct?
Value per visit, yeah.
Why do we generally not include lab and supply fees associated with treatment modality? So as an example, Invisalign 1800 versus Lightforce 800 versus traditional brackets at 500. So wouldn't that also impact the value?
Yeah, absolutely. And on one of the slides there, I did show margin per visit because that helps normalize that equation. Because what you're doing is you're taking what you're charging minus what you're paying for that. And so if it's a bracket system that's maybe $300 versus an aligner system that's $1,200, it does help normalize that. And then, where we were able to show the value there is that even, and I think what I showed is I said, if you're kind of in that middle 20%, a bracket producer, it's still better than, or middle 20% aligner producer, you're still more profitable from a margin standpoint than you are the number one bracket producer from an efficiency standpoint. So there's some benefit there. So that one chart, if you guys go back and reference that, it will show that that is taken into a consideration as well. And in the regression model, I mean, value per visit does come up, but also expenses are factored in there. So when you think about all those correlations with each other, it is taking into account share of chair. It's taking in, so if you have a higher aligner shared chair, it's going to take in weight the fact that you're paying more for that versus the bracket. So that all gets, comes out in the wash with the regression analysis.
Okay. Okay. And then, so speaking of normalization, can you tell us I know that you showed that chart and it was aggregate across all the practices. Is it possible to normalize that to one doctor? And do you have that information based on just one doctor?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we absolutely could rerun the analysis based on one doctor. I don't have it now, so but absolutely could.
We'll probably put you in touch with the person who asked the question so
sure.
that maybe they could get that information. Okay, so we also had the question, how do we get our own practice scorecard and analyze how to improve the data?
That's something you can work directly with Gaidge. And we would, if you have the Gaidge system, or if you have Gaidge plus the overhead, that's how we put it all together. But if it was a one practice, I mean, that's what our consulting team does. They'd be able to put this together for you and understand where you're at. So it would be just kind of more of a one-off, and we just work with you one-off on that one.
Love that. Love that. Yeah. So reach out to Gaidge if you're interested in seeing, more specifics about this for your own practice. So let's talk about the future of the orthodontic field, considering the new orthodontic residencies that are opening up. So will the saturation affect the field? So kind of what's your thought on that?
Saturation of more orthodontists out there?
Odontists, correct.
I mean, in my opinion, I don't see that. I see there's still a lot of demand out there. If we go back to the chart where we saw the 331 million, the 100 million that need treatment, and the 4 to 5 million that are actually in treatment. I mean, obviously, I know GPs are taking up some of the share, right? And we don't track that. We don't see that just because we don't have that in our data set, but we know it's happening. But I also know that there's a lot of folks out there that are ripe for orthodontics. And so, it's going to take probably some more targeted marketing for practices and location specific stuff as far as where you're located. But I do believe it's a healthy business and there's a healthy runway there. Obviously, I mean, the other piece that's maybe a little bit of a cause of concern is the birth rates are down. And so as I think we get into 25, 26, 27, I think you're going to start seeing those orthodontic age kids. There's less of them as a function of birth rates. I think Chris Benson talked about that in some of his presentations, even at Nexus, I believe he did. So, that could be a cautionary thing that's out there. And we have seen the decline in adults as well. So, I mean, adults aren't coming in as much. The whole Zoom effect is is not what it used to be. Even I think pre-COVID, we were seeing adult starts. I think I mentioned earlier on the call is about 6% growth. They spiked to 24%, and now, you know, we're flat with adults to slightly down. So, you know, that market's turned off a little bit. I don't know if that's going to be, you know, going on for a while, or if that's just a temporary thing based on a surge in demand because of the Zoom effect, and it'll kind of normalize itself out. There's another slide I think that in a different deck, and it shows just the discretionary spending income of an average household in America, and I think it's 89, 90,000, something like that. And then you start stripping out taxes and everything else, but what's left over is about $9,000 that the orthodontist or others are fighting for their discretionary dollars that are left over. And so I think we see that you know, a parent will most likely take their kid into an orthodontist if both of them need treatment, and maybe hold off on themselves in that standpoint. But you know, we've seen, obviously, I mean, inflation, I think, is impacting the market. I mean, what are we paying for food these days? You know, you go to a restaurant, things are just extremely expensive compared to what they were. So, you know, that is having an impact where wages aren't keeping up necessarily with inflation over the last 2 years. Now, according to, you know, some of the models we've seen, that, you know, I think this year is going to be more of a rinse and repeat. We should see some growth coming in 25 and 26. Now this ITR group predicts a great recession, or Great Depression, I mean, in 2030. So if you go to their website, there's a lot of information. They've been on that for the last 5 years and haven't wavered off of it. So 2030 is going to be interesting to watch, because there's a lot of factors, and I'm not an economist to be able to explain this well, but there's a lot of things that are going to come to a head, so to speak, and it potentially might lead to that, you know, 100 years later, having the Great Depression again. So, you know, I don't want to scare anybody, and gosh, I hope that never happens, but they're hot on it, and they're talking about it, and, you know, we're getting closer to it. We're only 6 years away. So just something to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, so you know, OrthoFi is really watching the adult trend very closely. And, you know, you mentioned at the beginning of the webinar that the aligner had dropped a little bit, the aligner share, and we think that's, you know, directly correlates to the adult starts, and we think that directly correlates to the economy. And, you know, you've got adults who are, you know, they may come in with their child, but when things are tight, they're not going to take care of themselves during that time. So we think it's super important, as we being OrthoFi, that the open choice payment is very important, especially during this time, that you're making it as affordable as possible for adults to start treatment, or you're going to continue to see that decline. So I have one more question for you, Ryan. I know we had you as a guest on Metrics That Matter, our Metrics That Matter platform, in December, I believe. And just kind of following that format a little bit, I always love to ask our guests kind of at the end of those webinars, like, if you're going to pay attention to one metric for the next, you know, next quarter or the next quarter, so, you know, in the next, you know, next 3 to 6 months, if there's one metric or two that you think are super important that a practice is absolutely watching and paying attention to, what would you say is most important to be looking at right now?
I think you distill it down to starts per day. I mean, we see that that's about 50% of what's driving the profit in the practice. And so if you can use that on your scorecards and in your team huddles, and it's all about starts per day. And I know the aggregate was 3, and that's going to include, you know, single doctor practices to bigger practices in aggregate. Maybe a single doctor is a little bit less, but on average, if you're looking at a metric, starts per day is really, really critical, right? And then what can you do with treatment efficiency to minimize the number of visits, because that also cascades back into profitability. So those are the two that. And that's why in this presentation, we try to distill it down to profit per day and starts per day. Everything's on a per day, so that you have a very simple metric that, hey, every day I wake up and I got to go get 3. That's what I got to do. So
love that. Yeah, I'm reading Atomic Habits right now, and it all goes down, you know, how are you going to just get better every day? And so I'm loving what you're talking about there. So that'll wrap up, Ryan, and our questions. Victoria, who's helping me with this webinar, if you don't mind going ahead and sharing the slide here. We are actually now offering a free practice assessment, we being Gaidge. I mean, I'm sorry, we being OrthoFi. offering a free practice assessment when you complete an overview. So this assessment benchmarks your practice versus the market and OrthoFi averages on up to 8 key metrics related to the main drivers of your business growth, cash flow, and write-off risk. So if you are interested in getting a free practice assessment, then we would love to provide an overview for you. So Victoria, if you'll go ahead and move to that next slide. We are also offering a discount on the setup fee if you use this QR code to schedule your demo, your overview. And then, of course, you'll get that practice assessment. So we would love to talk to you about what OrthoFi can do for your practice. I know that Ryan and team at Gaidge would love to talk to you about what Gaidge can do. Our two companies are integrated so that you can, take advantage of the data from both companies. And we'd love to see you working with both of us just to improve the growth and the visibility into what's going on in your practice. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a very informative and fantastic webinar, and we'll hope you join us again sometime soon.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks, everybody.
And thanks to everyone else who've joined us. We'll see you next time.
All right. Take care. Bye.